Wilderness Lady, A History of Crossett, Arkansas, 1980, by John Wordy Buckner. Logging is one of the most important phases of lumber operations. In Ashley County, where neither heavy snows nor high mountains existed, methods of logging were unlike those of the Pacific Coast or in the North. Around the turn of the century, the Carolog, a two-wheeled cart, was supplemented in most logging operations by eight-wheeled Lindsay wagon. The Crossett Company, from its beginning in 1902, used the eight-wheeled wagon until modern gasoline-powered vehicles outmoded the employment of work animals. Oxen, horses, and mules were used to pull the eight-wheeled wagons over muddy roads. Logs were snaked out to roads by either horses or oxen and then loaded on log wagons, which usually had from 4 to 6 inch tires and short spokes. Mules were first used to some extent, but had smaller hooves and sank into the soft ground too readily. Oxen didn't sink so readily, and Percheon horses with large hooves did even better than oxen. Mules, however, were rugged and used in dry weather, especially for snaking logs. The bummers were carts with wide tired wheels used to haul logs from where they were felled to loading areas. The bummer stood high off the ground, and the big end of the log was fastened under the axle to prevent it from hanging on stumps, brush, and small trees. Logs were also fastened to tongues attached to chains and snaked singly to a nearby road. This method of bunching logs to be loaded on wagons knocked down young trees and was used mainly near loading points. It is significant that the Crossett Company never used steam skidders in pulling logs to loading areas. The skidder employed by most large companies used a long cable and grappling hooks to pull logs from far out in the forest to wagons or cars. It destroyed all timber that had not been cut, usually denuding the forest of small trees. It was a modern method, but Crossett even then thought it was best to protect growing stands of young timber. This attitude has always been a key factor in the company's logging operations. As tram roads extended farther and farther into the forest, more modern methods of lumbering came into vogue. The first steam locomotives operated by Crossett were small shay engines powered by steam and using pine knots for fuel. Fuel of these engines emitted excessive sparks, which led to numerous forest fires. Later, coal-burning engines were used. They caused fires, but not as frequently as wood-burning engines. These small engines pulled great strings of flat cars loaded with logs over tram roads. The first tram road from the mill was built south to Hickory Grove, where the company established a lumber camp. Spurs were built out from the main line into the woods, one for every 40 acres. The logs were piled along the spur for loading. At first, the logs were loaded by horses or mules. Small poles about 6 inches in diameter were slanted from the ground to the flat car, and a chain was placed under the log and secured to a double tree at both ends. The team then pulled away from the flat car on the opposite side, and the log rolled up the skids onto the floor. A chain puller was often used to bring the chain back to load the next log. When 10 to 30 cars had been loaded with logs, the little shay engine pulled them slowly to the mill. Brakes on flat cars were poor. Couplings often gave away, causing the cars to cut loose and move in the opposite direction. When this happened, there was nothing to do but allow the cars to find their own stopping place, which is usually an incline or flat area. Then the engine backed to the cars and rehooked them for the trip to the mill. The Crossett Lumber Company had a large mill pond, always filled with water, for the purpose of storing logs and floating them to the chain which transported them to the saws. 2 or more men with spikes attached to long poles guided the logs to the chain. The idea of a mill pond then was not preservation but merely for ease of handling. The cars were stopped on sharp incline at the head of the mill pond. When the stakes were cut are knocked out, the logs rolled down the incline into the pond. Building track for roads and spurs was a tremendous task in the early days. Swampers with axes and saws cleared the right-of-way for the railways. The swamper was also called a flathead and used cross-cut saws, single-bit or double-bit axes, and brush hooks. The task was performed both by black people and white people. In such crews, the boss was always a white man. A new recruit was often put to work in the swamping crew to prove his skill and reliability. Many of the early swampers later became dependable employees of the company. Dynamite was used to blow larger stumps from the right-of-way. The construction gang followed the swampers and laid both the ties and rails for the road. The road beds for the spur tracks were often slightly graded or ungraded. Road beds for the main trams, however, were well graded, especially in low areas where water was likely to stand for extended periods. Some of the well-graded road beds can still be seen, though they have not been used for 30 years. A steel gang in good weather could lay about 3/4 of a mile of track daily. Skilled men were required to fell the huge trees and were paid as much as $2.50 a day. A sawyer had to be durable, strong, and skilled. Failure to fell a tree in the right direction might bring death or serious injury to himself and others. Felling timber was accomplished by 2 workers using a cross-cut saw. The greatest danger occurred when immediately before the tree was expected to fall, it split in 2 or more fragments. One or more parts might crash down upon the sawyers. Splitting often resulted from faulty underbiting, and sometimes the wind forced the tree to fall before the cut was completed. Another danger occurred when a tree, while falling, was arrested in its descent and held up from the ground by other timber. To dislodge the tree required removal of the obstacle, and out of control it might become upon the sawyers. The water boy in the Crossett woods was a spectacular figure in the early days. He usually rode a mule with 2 kegs of water on each side of the mule, held securely by leather straps over or behind the saddle. The water boy rode through the woods yelling, "Water boy! Water boy!" He yelled loudly to warn timber cutters not to throw a tree into his path, and also to inform them that water was available. The sawyers and swampers made up songs about water boys to tease them. Everett Ross, a longtime employee of the Crossett Company, was a water boy at 12 years of age and rode a mule named Pickle, who lived to be 36 years old. Levi Murphy, a water boy at 14 years of age, rode a mule named Monk. The water boy sometimes received as much as $1.35 a day. Often woods crews suspended their work to fight fires caused by the Shea engines. The company was always anxious to prevent forest fires. Cap Gates and others once fought and brought under control a fire at Sharp's place. When it was over, Cap Gates took a coal and wrote, "Please pay Bill Sharp $32.85 for 5 panels of fence and charge it to hell and destruction." Rafting was common among mill owners whose plants were located near streams, but the Crossett mills were too distant from rafting streams and their holdings too compact to make floating practical. If rafting had been used, it would still have been necessary to transport logs by other means from the river to the mill, a distance of 8 miles. Once, however, because of an emergency, rafting was used. In 1915, a storm or cyclone felled approximately 8 million board feet of timber near the Louisiana line. This timber was salvaged by cutting and floating it to a landing on the Ouachita River near Vaughn. From there, it was hauled by tram to the mill. The company mills were built in the midst of a virgin forest. During a brief period in the early years, timber surrounding the mills was the first to be cut. As logging operations extended further away from Crossett, it became necessary to build camps or villages in the depths of the forest for workers engaged in timber cutting. The villages and camps were usually temporary. When all the timber in the vicinity of logging villages had been cut, the buildings were moved farther out into the forest to new locations. Crossett usually had 3 such villages, each of which had an average of 500 people, consisting of workers and other families, and controlled by a boss whose word was the prevailing law. The Crossett villages, in construction and convenience, were usually for the time. Camp houses of from 2 to 4 rooms were built in such a way that they could be transported on flat cars to a new location. Camp houses were later moved to Crossett, and some are still used as they were when brought to town. They were tight, ceilinged, and painted. Houses for black people were located on one side of the camp and whites on the other. The camp boss saw that there were never any racial troubles. The house for the black people were identical to that of the whites in construction and convenience. The camp Earl Nams lived in, a Crossett camp, was located on Shamanahaw Creek. Huge oak trees lined well-kept streets. Each employee was required to keep his house and yard in good order. The town crew painted houses and fences regularly and made repairs when necessary. If a resident did not properly keep his yard, the town crew did it for him and charged it to his account. Employees who were disrupted or conducted themselves improperly were similarly dismissed and ordered to leave. The Crossett camp had every convenience of the time, such as a good public school and regular religious services. There was also a young men's Christian association with a full-time secretary. There was a baseball field, basketball court, rook, roller skating, hunting, fishing, play parties, and long walks down the road crossing for the young couples on Sunday afternoons. Crossett Camp had a machine shop for repairing locomotives, and dynamite was stored in a concrete bunker about a mile outside of the camp. In many ways, the commissary was the center of the logging village. Here, residents of the village met when shopping for necessities. Though the occupants periodically traveled to Crossett by train, the commissary provided most necessities. Sugar, flour, and meal were stored in barrels. Bolts of cloth filled the shelves. Sardines, crackers, peaches, salmon, and other goods could be had from the shelves. Salt meat was always near the end of the counter and cut into weights desired by customers. Women came and went, but men, when not working, lounged on the commissary porch to watch the pretty girls pass by. Dr. Charles F. Taylor, appointed by the federal government to investigate conditions in logging camps in 1919, had much to say about the Crossett camp. According to Taylor, the camp was kept scrupulously clean, and the housewives could have electric iron and a fan. Single men were provided one room with a sleeping porch close to the boarding house. Regular church services were held once a week, and weekly moving pictures. Rent ranged from $3.25 to $4.25 for 4 rooms monthly, which included utilities. Experiments in mosquito eradication proved successful at the Crossett camp through screening and spraying oil on areas covered by stagnant water. The experiments were successful in the town of Crossett and other lumber camps. Logging methods changed little until the introduction of machines such as multi-wheeled trucks, trailers, and loaders. In fact, methods of early years are still occasionally used. Mules during wet weather and exceptional conditions are still used to snake timber out of the woods, and in emergencies. The kind of sled employed to move heavy machinery in Crossett before the coming of railroads is sometimes used to transport pulpwood to the roadside. However, the sled is now made of steel. The axe has not entirely disappeared, but it is only seldom that one sees a crosscut. The development of heavy automotive trucks and trailers revolutionized logging in the South. Heavy trucks provided more economical transportation and made tram roads and locomotives outdated for moving logs from the forests to the mills. The company, employing new methods, also learned that contract logging was more economical. In addition, company logging villages, always an important cost, were no longer needed. By the early 1930s, every phase of harvesting pulpwood and logging was conducted by local contractors. Contractors are businessmen who invest vast amounts of capital and many men. A contractor usually harvests all the timber on one of 10 sections of Crossett Forest. His investment in trucks, loaders, tractors, pallets, slides, saws, and other material may run as high as $250,000. Wages are relatively good. Those figures are for 1968. The truck trailer driver performs the hardest work in the industry. He must work in thick brush, in rain and mud, and during summer and winter. If raw materials fail to reach the mills, the entire plant operation ceases. It is becoming increasingly difficult to hire efficient sawmen. Mr. James Burks, logging contractor for Georgia Pacific Corporation, believes that increased production and reduction of manpower can be accomplished through the use of tractor-powered saws. Although more economical in operation, the new method will destroy greater amounts of young timber. In recent times, the Forestry Department has become ultimately responsible for all procurement of timber and delivery of raw materials to the mills. The first objective is preservation of young timber and reforestation of cutover lands. Selective cutting is practiced whereby timber for specific purposes receives special marks before loggers enter the woods. In a typical forest or section, poles, the most valuable timber, are the first to be cut. Poles sold to dealers are felled by power saws, peeled, snaked out by tractor to roadsides, where they are machine loaded for transportation to the pole yards. There they are graded and shipped. Marketable pulpwood is usually cut with a McCulloch chainsaw, loaded on steel pallets, and pulled by tractors to loading points. A machine lifts the pallets to the bodies of the truck. In wet weather, a steel slide is hitched under pallets to make snaking easier. Chainsaws have increased production of man 400%. One man can now cut 4 cords of pulpwood, whereas he formerly produced 1 per day. An even newer method is now being tried, whereby trees suitable for both pulpwood and poles are cut in one operation and mechanically loaded. This invention is not yet universally accepted but shows promise. Pulpwood contractors also cut tops of logs that have been felled and harvest skinned, bent, or broken timber. The splitting gun, a recent innovation, is a steel wedge which is fired into timber and splits it into parts. The splitting gun, developed by engineers of the pulpwood industry, is a great time saver. It divides the timber into 2 or more pieces, making wood easier to load and more adaptable to debarkers and choppers. Cutting of logs for saw and plywood mills is almost wholly a mechanical process. The tree, felled by a chainsaw, leaves a short stump. The sawyer makes an undercut in the direction he wishes the tree to fall. He then shifts to the opposite side and makes his cut through to the undercut. This causes the tree to fall in the desired direction. Tong hooks are attached to the ends of the logs, and the logs are moved to the skid pans by Caterpillar tractors. As many as 6 logs may be skidded out to the loading area on one pan. The skid pan prevents logs from being stopped by roots, stumps, and other timber while being snaked to the loading area. The Caterpillar tractor runs on its own shoes or pads, moving over soft, boggy areas, making snaking logs easier and faster. Piles of logs are heaped up by the road where they await the loaders and trailer trucks. Logs up to 3 feet in diameter are loaded by a bantam loader. All makes of truck trailers and 6 wheels on trucks and 8 on trailers are common in Crossett logging operation. These truck trailers haul as many as 4,000 feet of timber at a time over graveled and blacktop roads to the mills. From the woods, the logs are hauled to the mills where they are weighed, scaled, and dumped into the mill pond for easier transportation to the endless chain. Once on the chain, they are washed by a powerful spray of water and debarked, the bark used for fuel. Washing of logs makes manufacture easy. A magnet is used to ascertain if logs contain any ferrous materials, and if found, the logs are resawed to prevent damage to the saws and other equipment. In 1956, pulpwood producers and logging contractors collected $7 million from the company. The logging contractor operates only on company lands, while pulpwood producers may buy wood anywhere and sell to the company. In the same year, there were 36 pulpwood producers in 5 states supplying the company mills. They sold the company 250,000 cords of wood, employed 1,000 men, and operated equipment valued at $900,000. Since the demise of tram roads and logging camps, Crossett has built and maintained a network of graveled roads through its holdings. This enables contractors to conduct logging operations in all sections of Crossett lands. Once the roads are built, they become public roads. Roads also serve as fire breaks and drainage, enabling loblolly pines to grow better and make forests more accessible to sportsmen and the supervision of the foresters. Lumber companies in the early years of the 19th century, except for inferior trees, removed all timber from their lands. They used the skidder in logging operations, destroyed most of the trees rejected by lawyers. In addition, the age-old practice of burning the woods in the spring season to provide tender grass for cattle prevented natural reforestation. Each year from 1900 to 1916, Arkansas produced 1 billion board feet of lumber. At this rate of cutting, a general belief existed that by the 1930s, all virgin timber would be exhausted. Most lumbermen believed that it would take too long to grow merchantable timber and expected to cease operations after the original forests had been consumed. But a far-seeing men believed that with long growing seasons and abundant rainfall, a second crop of timber might be produced over a 50-year period. They therefore protected seed trees and attempted, often unsuccessfully, to end the practice of burning the woods every spring season. The pioneer in reforestation in the South, Henry Hartner of Urania, Louisiana, began reforestation as early as 1916. Officials of Crossett inspected results achieved by Hartner and were convinced that a profitable second crop of valuable timber could be grown. Already, a young crop of trees had sprung up on company cutover lands that proved reforestation economical and practical. In some areas untouched by fire, a new growth had sprung up almost large enough for cutting. It now appeared to company officials that with scientific management, lumber operations could be made permanent. Cap Gates said, quote, "The biggest thing we have done is to work out a practical program of perpetual operation," unquote. The company employed its first forester in 1922. Whose first duties were confined chiefly to fire prevention. Shovels, axes, and wet pine tops were the primitive tools used to extinguish and retard fires. Also installed was the practice of leaving 2 seed trees on each acre of land and all small timber that, if left to grow, would within a few years increase in value. By 1929, selective cutting and the adjustment of mill operations to annual growth was instituted. Scientific forest management had now become a major factor in company operation. John Wissert of the Forestry Division explained in detail the work of the department. According to Wissert, Presently, there are 11 forestry districts, each of which consists of 50,000 acres. Each district is managed by a district forester with 8 or more assistants. Foresters are responsible for prevention of fires and disease, and also determine the number and kinds of trees that are marketable. Contract loggers cut only timber selected by the foresters. Over the years, the forestry department assumed increasing importance in company operations. Its chief responsibility was to provide a continuous source of raw materials for the industry. Forest officials procured materials from lands owned by others and grew timber on the immense holdings of the company. Perhaps fundamental to forest reproduction was the problem of fire prevention. Districts used heavy trucks and plows to confine and extinguish fires that sporadically broke out in the woods. In the early days, the problems of fire control were exceedingly difficult to handle. The age-old custom of burning dead grass in the spring season had to be broken, and this took time. Overnight, the young grass sprang up after a fire and nourished cattle. In time, through education and legislation, wood fires virtually disappeared. Nature has always been the best reforester. Seedlings from native trees have been proved to be superior to those obtained from other sections of the country, perhaps because they are already acclimated. Nature is aided in many ways by forest experts. Soil is sometimes chopped up to make a more acceptable seed bed. Hand planting and seeding from aeroplanes are practiced. By careful seeding, soil culture, and breeding, foresters expect to eventually produce super trees. Already the characteristics of trees have been upgraded, but more importantly, experts hope to produce faster growing timber with a greater resistance to disease. Since pine is the most valuable of all trees, they are grown on all land that will properly produce them. Underplanting is used to encourage pine growth in areas where hardwoods are of poor quality. Hardwood is encouraged on land where it produces high-quality timber. Two methods of disposing of undesirable timber are burning and spraying. When an area is controlled burned, it is precisely marked off. Moisture content of the air and wind velocity have to be taken into consideration when burning, or good areas of timber might also go up in smoke. Controlled burning, unharmful to healthy pines, destroys undesirable species. It is a practice that must be repeated to ensure a pure stand of pine. Undesirable trees and shrubs are also removed by spraying. Chemicals under great pressure injected among the tree kills off unwanted growth, but leaves pines unharmed. The collection and planting program is interesting as well as vital to forest production. Seeds are usually bought from the natives who gather cones from timber cut by loggers in the fall season. Each bushel of cones contains 25,000 to 30,000 seeds. Preference is given to loblolly pine seeds because this species grows faster than shortleaf and produces wood that is almost as valuable. Gathered cones are stored at the forestry station and allowed to dry until they are picked up by the state forestry truck. The seeds are removed from the cones and de-winged. Seeds are most easily stored when de-winged and also easier to plant. It has been found from tests that seeds from southeast Arkansas produce better trees than those gathered from any other section. The seeds are planted by the state forestry nursery in ground rented by Crossett Company. The baby pines are then removed and planted by machine or by hand on company lands. Thousands of trees are given to farmers who grow them under the supervision of company foresters. The state also buys seeds from natives for reforestation and supply annually from 20 to 30 million shortleaf and loblolly seedlings. Ordinarily, a Whitfield contour planter, because it can go around sharp curves, is ideal for underplanting. The trailer-type planter is used for open areas. An almost ideal method of seeding is by air, by which as many as 1,300 acres may be planted in 7 1/2 hours. In 1960, the department planted 5,000 acres in pine seedlings. By conforming to nature's design, the best planting time of the year is between December and March. Working closely with the Forestry Department is Custer Ross, District Forester employed by the state, the Dean of all Arkansas foresters. Ross and his crew, particularly in fire control, cooperate with the company Forestry Department. Under the direction of Ross, the area is patrolled regularly by plane for fire detection. When fires are discovered, crews with hand tools, tractor plows, water, saws, and axes quickly cut lanes through the timber to contain fires. Ross is now retired. For many years, Yale University operated a camp at Crossett for the purpose of giving first-hand training to candidates for master's and PhD degrees in the School of Forestry. Yale University's interest in the Crossett forestry practices began when Dr. H. Chapman, veteran professor of forestry at Yale, served as a consultant in the institution of the company's reforestation program. The forestry students spent 11 weeks at the camp where there was neither telephone nor television. Company officials and experts often gave lectures on forestry management. Dr. Meyer, a veteran teacher at the camp, believed that the best way to learn is by observation and participation. Dr. Meyer also believed that the Crossett Company had one of the best forestry programs in the world. Students at Yale Camp received instruction in timber estimating, spotting, insects, disease, measurements, and fire control. In addition to being exposed to modern management, they also learned the latest technique in sawmill, paper mill, and logging practices. The Crossett Camp for Yale students emphasized dirt forestry, or the actual raising and care of trees from the time they were seedlings until they emerged as products of the mills. When the university decided to emphasize training of forestry scientists, the Crossett Camp was closed in 1966, and students from Yale no longer came. Established in 1930, the United States Forest Research Station, located 8 miles south of Crossett, was directed by R. Reynolds. This project grew out of the work of the Crossett Company. A Mr. Wickersham of Yale, forester for Crossett, persuaded the company to set aside 30,000 acres for selective cutting. In 1934, the company gave the United States Forestry Service 1,680 acres, and an office was established at the present site. The buildings were built by the Works Progress Administration, and all roads were constructed by hand labor. In 1968, according to Reynolds, $500,000 worth of research was in progress. Since the entire project could be destroyed by one devastating fire, protection is a dire necessity. The station relies upon the state, the Crossett Company, and its own efforts to prevent disastrous fires. Up until the present, not one single experiment has been lost because of fire. The Crossett Research Station is a Southern Forest Research Station, one of 10 in the country, and it is primarily concerned with the loblolly and shortleaf pine. Slash is one of the best southern pines and grows well along pond and watercourses. It is a rapid growing tree with long needles and few insects attack it, but it is highly susceptible to fire. The Crossett area is located too far north for the slash pine to thrive. Pines native in the area are the best producers. Shortleaf pines stand drier and poorer soils and sprouts when burned. Loblolly, more resistant to disease, does not grow in waterlogged soils. The number 6 shortleaf pine at the station is 32 years old, 25 inches in diameter, and 100 feet tall. In the Crossett area, the soil is poor but well suited for trees. In some places, the wind-blown soil is 25 feet in depth. In the Crossett area, only about 5 feet. Water is first reached at about 25 and later around 60 feet. The soil holds water well, and on experimental plots, which have been irrigated, the trees get their supply of moisture from rainfall. The United States Experiment Station constantly seeks to discover an outstanding tree and finds about 1 in 3/4 of every million. The cones of superior trees are kept, and seedlings from them are planted carefully and checked through the years to determine if they reproduce the characteristics of their parents. One of the most encouraging quests and most interesting is the constant search for the plus tree, one that is far superior to others that grow around it in the same type of soil and under the similar conditions. The plus trees are recorded by number and location. Periodically, they are measured to determine height, diameter, straightness, distance to the first branches, and crown. Even the direction of branch growth is noted. Foresters have observed that branches that grow straight out from the trees instead of upward toward the crown prune themselves quicker and leave less scars on bodies of the timber. These unique trees are crossed with similar ones, and careful record of parentage is kept. It usually takes 10 years to determine whether or not a tree is really superior. If outstanding, more crosses of this tree with others are made. It is hoped that from superior pines, a tree that will grow faster, larger, and taller can be grown. Moreover, the wood would be of better quality. A considerable period of time is needed to breed experimental trees. An agriculturalist may determine the effects of a cross or some other experiment with cotton or watermelons from 1 to 2 years, but it takes half a century or more to achieve the same result in a forest with trees. However, since the work of the experiment station began and the Forestry Division accelerated its forest development and protection work, significant improvement of forests have been noted. The United States Experiment Station is able to report good results from super trees. At present time, there are 40,000 young trees under study from hybrids to super trees. Also, there are 160,000 trees being studied from crosses made by foresters. Reynolds says that the pine crosses readily, the shortleaf with loblolly and the loblolly with the slash. Because of their great height, the super trees are more likely to suffer from lightning than shorter ones. One super tree is 69 years old, 108 feet tall, 18 4/10 inches in diameter. It has a wood gravity of 0.56 and a clean length of 76 feet. It appears that this is an elite tree that clearly demonstrates superior qualities over other pines. Meanwhile, the search goes on for super trees. At present, there are 100 of these super trees in Crossett forests, all identified by blue band and watched carefully. These unusual trees have been compared with 5 other trees growing close around them. They must be taller, straighter, faster growing, and possess a more perfect crown. A pipe is extended alongside to a distance of 2 feet above the ground of the tree. Insecticides are pumped through the pipe and sprayed to the top to protect cones from insects. The cones are gathered and the seeds planted in experimental plots. Not only are the seeds of the trees planted and their seedlings used in experimental plots, but grafts are made from them onto other good pines. Branches of super trees may also be rooted in special greenhouses under controlled conditions and later reset in the forest. Often they reveal the characteristics of the parent plant, but not in every instance. R. Reynolds discussed what is done to get new and superior trees. Growth of the stand must be carefully studied and should be thinned to a minimum of 1,500 trees on each acre. Reduction of the number of trees is done for the purpose of growing saw logs within a 30-year period. Soil moisture, more than anything, determines the growth of a tree. On account of moisture, normal trees grow only half the season. Rings in the wood of the tree tell stories about water, growth, disease, and seasons. The small, darker rings in pine are the summer growth and are much smaller but more compact than the lighter colored rings. The lighter colored rings indicate the spring growth when there is usually much more moisture. Spring growth wood produces pulp inferior to that of the summer. Samples of wood from irrigated trees show that they produce much more summer growth than those having less moisture. The aim, therefore, is to develop a tree that will require less moisture and produce better wood. Irrigation now seems impractical in large forests. On one such plot, trees have been allowed to grow since virgin timber was cut in 1915. Hardwoods and pine grow on this plot as nature determines. Since 1915, this area has grown approximately 13,510 board feet pine and 5,105 board feet hardwood per acre. This is approximately the volume of timber found per acre in virgin forests. The laboratory is well equipped for observation with soil and wood products of the forests. Here, a scientist analyzes soils to determine content, moisture holding power, and general ability to grow good trees. Experiments have proven that inbreeding retards growth and maximum development is achieved through crossbreeding. When a super tree is located, often pollination is allowed the first year. The second year, the pollen is gathered and used on other trees to boost quality in seedlings. Pine cones mature in 2 years, and the seedlings grow in the nursery or greenhouse for 1 year and then are reset in test areas. The United States Experiment Station, the Yale Camp, and the Forestry Department of Crossett have through the years cooperated in a continuing effort to grow better trees faster and to harvest timber on a schedule that will provide a continual industrial supply. As one forester stated in We Are the Crossett Company, quote, "Our job in the forestry division is seeing to it that there are raw materials, now and forever, to keep our company's manufacturing plant supplied," unquote. To accomplish this Herculean task, the forestry department uses 174 company employees and 72 independent contractors and shippers employing slightly over 1,400 people. Actually, the Forestry Department is the sustaining organization for the vast industries of the company. More than any other department, it determines the volume of production as well as the quality and the longevity.